So this session's going to be about core reporting, core module 1. So this is a very high level session about policy and business context for results. So if you have questions, use a chat. And if you do use a chat to ask your questions, please direct the questions to the entire audience so they may read the questions. At the end of the session, you'll be sent an evaluation form, so please do complete the evaluation form so we can improve on our training delivery. And at the end of the session, there's also going to be an email sent to you within 24 hours after the completion of the course. If you are new to results, and we did have a few people that are new to results and you're needing access to results, we have a results access policy which requires people to know something about results. So this testing website allows us to confirm that. Just complete the test questions based on what kind of user authority you require, but you need to pass the course in order to pass the test in order to get your access. And the test is comprised of a bunch of questions from multiple modules. So please only do the test when you've completed as many modules based on whatever session, whatever authority you require, but you're definitely going to have to review materials for at least 4 to 5 modules. So our module information is located on our training website. So if you can't attend a session, you can listen in to the recordings or you can review the PowerPoints. And so that's just a new process that we have if you do need to get access or renewal to results access. So today for this session, we're going to go through very high-level legislation reference and talk about the form and manner reporting, point to you where our key business documentation resides for results, and go over an opening life cycle and reporting frequency, and just general information about how to get access if you're new to results and how to get help if you run into problems with results. So we're going to go through the next few slides as legislative frameworks. And so I think the very key thing for you to know is results is a system that only existed since 2003. But prior to that, it's taking information from whatever the ministry had as far as other existing database system and paper-based files. So we do have records now that reside within results that are 20, 30 years old. We have ones that have legal obligations still that pertains to that are obligation under the Forest Practice Code Act of BC framework, but we also have FERPA. So when we're looking at records, we're dealing with old and new records. In some cases, some of the old records still have outstanding silviculture obligations. So this is why we talk about some of the code framework as well, because we're still dealing with that legacy of those obligations. So when we talk about the Forest Practice Code Act, we have certain sections that deals with requirements about what needs to be provided to results as well as reporting obligations. So this is something that you have to know about if you're involved with dealing with results. We're dealing with silviculture obligation openings where there's legal requirements for containing information about the, in this case, silviculture prescriptions or site plans, but it talks to also the requirements as far as the legal component, which is things like the stocking standards units, as well as information that needs to be reported like forest cover. So all the parts of the section of the legislation that I'll be highlighting actually speaks to things that are supposed to be collected in results or has to be supplied to results at certain points in time. So at the very highest level, we deal with things like the silviculture prescription or site plan. So there's requirements of what is the content of a site plan or a silviculture prescription. So in the sections that of the code, we have detailed information on what that needs to have in place. And so when we talk about silviculture prescriptions or site plans, we have a requirement also for maps as well. So when we start looking at the content requirements of results, you'll see how the legislation ripples into what results is to collect to meet that requirement of the legislation. We also have under the timber harvesting and silviculture practice regulation in terms of the content requirements of what is the site plan. And so what happens is that we have silviculture prescriptions. We also have ones that are called site plans without regeneration obligations. And this is things like commercial thinning or intermediate cuts. So they might not have regeneration obligation, but there's still a requirement to confirm that the stocking has been met as far as after a certain period after the harvesting has taken place. We also have Section 46, format and timing of reporting. So when you go into delve into those sections of the legislation, and we'll see that in successive slides, more about what has to be collected or supplied to the Crown and when. And then there's a section that provides the ministry the ability to establish requirements. So this will start getting into things like the form and manner reporting or the content requirements of what is supposed to be supplied as a part of the reporting requirements. And then maps as well, and what is required to be contained within the maps. And then there's also declarations that do take place, and if there's declarations that take place, that also gets supplied to the ministry as well. And while there's no woodlot holders in this particular session, they have also regulations that speaks to the content requirements of what they have to supply to Crown, and then also the frequency of when they have to report, and also information about declaration, and that's under their regulations for the woodlots. So when we deal with FERPA, we have similar kind of requirements at a high level where we have the requirements of reforesting stands to free growing, and then there's different kind of license types. But at the end of the day, if there's a requirement to have, if there's harvesting that's taking place, if there's a silviculture obligation, then what happens is that there's a requirement to meet free growing. We also have the same thing about, when you do declarations, that information is supplied as a milestone declaration. And then we also have things like Section 108 applications. So in some situations, if there's specific definitions of different kinds of catastrophic damages that have taken place, the licensee has the ability to request for either a relief of obligation or a request for funding under Section 108. So the provisions for that is in the legislation, but Results does have the form for licensees to make that request for Section 108 application. And then we get into like the content of a site plan, what needs to be in it, as well as meeting the requirement for free growing and information that needs to be supplied for free growing. And so again, this is kind of tying pieces of the legislation that relates to information in some way, shape, or form that has to be supplied into Results. And going down to Section 86, we get into the annual reporting. So this is where we're going to talk about that quite a lot later on in the slides, about when and what needs to be provided. And so it gives you kind of the scope of what is the content requirements of reporting. And then we have, again, things that tied to relief for funding, as well as declarations for silviculture obligations. And then we do have the regulation for woodlots as well, that deals with their annual reporting in terms of content, frequency of reporting, and things like also declarations as well as relief of obligation or funding requests for Section 108, and they have their version of it as Section 83. So going back for code blocks, what happens is that if we're to go into looking at the Section 46, which has their format and timing of reporting, and this kind of formulates part of the bread and butter of reporting that goes into Results. And what happens here is that it speaks to things like when harvesting is complete, there's reporting that has to take place, and when it must be provided to the ministry. And so it talks about Form A's, B's, and C's, which are things like the site plan, disturbance reporting, silviculture reporting, and forest cover reporting, and a map. And then later on in the different sections, it talks about also things like information that needs to be provided, like harvesting and silviculture treatments, if they're completed within the fiscal year, it needs to be reported by on or before May 31st. So it gets into like the nitty-gritty of, what has to be provided and when, as well as when we have the meeting of regeneration and free growing due dates. Then what happens is that the forest cover information needs to be supplied to the ministry. So this is kind of like the sort of the foundation of what the reporting requirements are. And then going further into section 48, it talks about the mapping requirements. So this is getting into when the forest cover is provided. This is the context of the types of information what we expect to see as far as the map, what it has to show, and it's like the opening boundary, has to have permanent access structure, any non-productive areas within the opening, non-commercial areas, and then it gets into the actual area that is managed. That's the net area to be reforested, any reserves. So it gets into making sure that it's very clear about what information needs to be provided. Jumping forward into FERPA, we do have section 86, which also speaks to those requirements. They're similar but slightly different, but the concept is still the same, where you're providing things like the site plan, the standards unit information, the legal obligations as far as the stocking standards, and what needs to be provided as part of the opening. And then it gets into silviculture reporting, disturbance reporting, forest cover reporting as well, and then also when the forest cover reports that have to be provided, which is typically post-harvest, before the regen delay due date has been met, and also forest cover reporting at the late free growing due date. So now, and then for FERPA, it's a default to now 20 years, right? So at the end of the day, there is the requirement for those reports for forest cover and also maps. Then woodlots have their own version of the regulations in terms of what needs to be reported for the code as well as for under FERPA. And so it's similar kinds of information, but the frequency is slightly different. But at the end of the day, they have also a form and manner in which they have to report by as well. So the key here is for results. What we've done is in order to translate the legislative requirement into something a little bit more structured, what has happened is that there's provision in the legislation to allow the chief forester to specify the form and manner of reporting. And what we've done now is that we've published a document that's called the Results Information Submission Specifications. There's a licensee edition. There's also another one for woodlot holders, and there's another one also for government-funded areas. The idea here is that this document is pretty much the form and manner of what needs to be reported to results. So that is the starting point of understanding the content requirements and the structure and expectation of what needs to be provided, and it ties back to the legislation. So it's important for you, if you're new to results, to be aware that if you're kind of looking at this, you understand the legislative authority, the authorization of why things have to be provided, and then the fact that this document, this results information submission specification, is then really the sort of the building blocks of what you have to supply, and that's the document you should be working from. So to access this document, if you're new to results, results has a website, and what happens is that under the business and policy tab, you'll find that there is a whole section that deals with submission specification, and the licensee edition is the one that we're going to be speaking to primarily for this session. But this is the document that you need to be aware of, and I think that other key piece for you to be aware of, this document gets updated from time to time to make any updates, revisions, and as of gosh, I forget what the date is, as of May of last year, what happened is that this document had been updated, that It's actually, yeah. So what happens is that it's been updated so that there is new requirements for basal area. And so I encourage you to review those, and also the fact that the tree retention forest cover document also reflects those changes for requiring basal area. So that's a new requirement that is effective as of last year, but their expectation is that the reporting coming in for forest cover will start having information that reflects this new basal area requirement. So just to highlight the fact that these documents are on the website, so it's this form and manner of reporting that you should be looking at in the case of licensee reporting. But there are these other versions as well, depending on what kind of background you're coming from as far as what kind of reporting you're dealing with. And so it's a combination of this licensee submission edition as well as this forest cover submission that sort of helps allow you to understand how to describe the forest cover information if you're dealing with tree retention. So this extra document here is more of a supplemental to help you with understanding how to structure your forest cover reporting. But at the end of the day, these form and manner of reporting documents are what you should be referring to. And when you go into those documents, what they do is they go into explaining the background on legislation, sort of the stuff that I just talked about earlier, gets into just very high level information about what ESF is. So this is Electronic Submission Framework and how it's supposed to work. Talks about the submission components. So what happens is that in the old world order, they talk about Form A, Bs, and Cs, and then it's basically things like the silviculture prescription or site plan. Talks about how you need to structure the different components, which is either the standard unit information, tenure information, disturbance reporting, activity reporting, and forest cover reporting, and they're broken up in different components. And in the document itself, there's some examples that will help you to sort of visualize how to break down some of the spatial map work that needs to be provided, because there's the requirement for providing silviculture prescription or site plan maps. Or also you need to provide forest cover maps. So when we're dealing with some of these different silvicultural systems where there's retention or reserves, there's some examples of that, but then drilling to that tree retention document, it gets to more illustrative examples that's more applied. So you can have that kind of help with knowing how to structure your submissions. And it tells you in the various different components, the data elements that are a part of the submission requirements, as well as telling you whether it's a mandatory requirement or not, and when they're optional or conditional. And there's extra information about each of those fields that may help you understanding how they all work. So it's really key for you to be familiar with these documents, and I refer to them quite often myself. So what happens is that for the next few slides, I'm going to go through a life cycle of an opening. Be mindful that when we're talking about openings, we're dealing with openings in a variety of different states. So some that are already in the system and they're like midway in that life cycle. I'm going to talk from beginning to end, but in the reality of these openings, you'll be working with new openings as well as existing openings where they require different levels of reporting depending where they are in the life cycle. So starting at the beginning, when we have reporting that takes place, what happens is that, again, this is speaking back to the legislation requirements. But what happens that when we have, upon harvest completion, for a fiscal year, there's a requirement to report on or before May 31st for major licensees, and there's a different deadline for woodlots. But the idea here is that when you have harvest completion, the expectation is that there's going to be an opening definition report, a disturbance report, and a forest cover report with map. And so that's usually the first submission that comes in for the opening. And I want to also emphasize that forest cover reporting is based on the harvest completion, right? Because sometimes we do see examples of forest cover coming in that do not indicate the harvest submission. And it's generally good practice to have the harvesting forest cover and then provide the next step, which is the planting or regeneration report. And that's because in some cases licensees plant very aggressively, and it might be within still a certain time frame, but it certainly helps us to sort of track the progression of the opening as it's coming in. The next step we have is planting, and again, there might be planting, there might not be planting. The stand may be left for natural regen, but if there is any planting or any silviculture activities that are being done for the opening, then there's a requirement for reporting that. And what happens is that the way the reporting works is that any activities completed within the fiscal year, the reporting needs to be done and submitted into results by May 31st. So that's the way it reads. And then for woodlots, it could be it's activities completed annually, and then their deadline is like April 30th, right? So depending which legislative framework they're dealing with, but the idea is that they have to look at their reporting timelines as well. So the next milestone that occurs is at regen. So this is on or before the regeneration due date. What happens is that there needs to be a forest cover information that is supplied to results. So this is really to confirm that they've achieved regeneration. So what happens here is that at this point in milestone, there is the ability to do a declaration for the regeneration, but it is optional for licensees. It's probably standard good practice. So some licensees have certification programs where they do that. They provide that information. It's also a demonstration of due diligence. So it is something that is there, but the mandatory piece is the forest cover that has to be supplied with an updated map as well. And in the case of woodlots, they have the option of providing regeneration information based on like the forest cover at regeneration due date. So it's really if it's something that's required in their development plans or stewardship plans, or if they volunteer to provide that information, results certainly will accept that information. And then after regeneration, between then and free growing, if there was any other silviculture activities that have taken place, then there's the ability to report that as well. Again, activities completed within the fiscal year, but reported into results on or before May 31st. And the same date lines for woodlots as well, if they do have any other silviculture activities. And then finally, we have the free growing milestone, and what happens is that on or before the free growing due date, the forest cover is supplied, and at this point in time, free growing milestone declaration is often supplied by a licensee only because by doing so, then that demonstrate that they have met the legal requirements, and so most licensees do their free growing declarations. But what happens is that if you do provide the free growing milestone, forest cover information, the free growing forest cover information is a mandatory requirement. So later on in other sessions, we talk about what is required legally versus what the system enforces systematically. They're two different things. Legally, the requirement is that forest cover for free growing must be supplied prior to making that free growing declaration. And then what happens is that by making that free growing declaration, what happens is that that limitation of liability for the prescribed period sets the clock for 15-month period. So if there's nothing wrong with that particular declaration after 15-month time, then basically there's no legal obligation remaining on that stand, right? So that's sort of the incentive for a lot of licensees to do that declaration, so that basically it sets the clock for that limitation of liability. So that's giving you a whole overview of the reporting, sort of the frequency, when you have to report, and the life cycle of an opening. But being mindful here, and I don't have it on the slide, but should probably think about that, in terms of enhancements is that any point in time during this life cycle, in some situations, let's say if there's a problem with the standards units where there's not an ability to meet certain milestones for a variety of reasons, it could be catastrophic damage occur, you need to do a Section 108 application, but then the timelines by which you can meet those requirements are no longer achievable, in which case you may need to submit an amendment of some sort, right? Depending on what document we're dealing with, whether it's a silviculture prescription or a site plan, you might have to provide an amendment. So at any point in time throughout this life cycle, there's also the ability for you to make a change to the standards unit as required. And so, but this is something that is extremely dynamic based on the site situation that you have. So, and then, like I said, we're talking from start to finish, but we're working with ongoing openings that have ongoing commitments. So there's reporting happening at any point in time for any of these milestones or reporting components that we're dealing with for a given licensee. So just to make sure that you're aware that that can happen as well, right? So you've got changes to standards units. That is in itself a whole separate module. So really what's really important for you is the fact that if you're involved with dealing with results and you're reporting, you're working with legal documentation. So legal documents, which means that, you know, there's licensee's obligation. So it's a document that, you know, you have to understand what is happening and what if you're making changes to or submitting for, you're actually, you know, making you're providing information to meet a certain legal requirement. So as far as your responsibility is that you have to have an understanding of what those legal requirements are. You have to have authorization to report on behalf of the licensee. So when we go in through and you're actually involved with making a request for results, you have to have authorization by the licensee to allow to have them authorize you to modify their records. And likewise on the ministry side, if you're a ministry person, if you're involved with doing things like approvals and stuff, you're actually, or making change, when there's changes happening to standards unit, you understand that legal obligations are being changed and having understanding of the context of that. And so you all need to have sufficient knowledge and training to be able to report into results. And so, and then really your job, as well as when you're making changes to results and submitting that information, there's a requirement to make sure the information is accurate as per the submission standard, that those submission documents that I talked about goes into what is required, what's mandatory, and towards the back there's also a lot of details about data submission standards, mapping standards, so all that stuff has to be met. So if you're new to results, how to get access. So on our website, you'll find that there is a specific location that speaks to how to get access. There's information about the policy, as well as depending on what user you are, you want to get access. You have to click on the appropriate links, and then what happens is that you're given a form, and there's going to be some components of authorization. If it's your ministry person, probably authorized by someone in the ministry that is probably a DM or DM designate person. And then for private sector, there'll be authorization required from the licensee. And consultants, if they're working on behalf of a licensee, has to get authorization from the licensee as well. So this session is pretty short and sweet, but it gives you sort of a high-level understanding of how it all works, legislation framework, key documents, and sort of overview of what is the different components of reporting that needs to take place. And so I encourage you to look up those documents if you're new to it. And so that's pretty much what I wanted to present today. And if you have any questions about what I've talked about, it's a good time to go through that. And I'm just going to stop my recording.